Good afternoon, my name is Bihan Poudec and I am here today to present my research on demobilization, disarmament and reintegration in Colombia. As most of you already know, Colombia was crippled by a civil war for 52 years. This conflict was the longest in the Western Hemisphere. It led to the death of over 200,000 people and displaced millions. In 2016, the Colombian President Santos signed a historical and landmark peace agreement with the FARC in Havana, Cuba. This agreement was rejected in a referendum later on by the population. It was modified and passed through Parliament that same year. Its implementation began in January 2017 after more than 50 years of civil war. Now in its third year, the implementation is slow, uneven, and is encountering several difficulties. In August 2019, some ex-FARC leaders called for the return to an armed insurgency against the government, citing the failures of the Colombian government in implementing the peace agreement. I was in Colombia during that summer of 2019. I was doing a peace-building training in Cali, and I was confronted to a much less optimistic picture of the peace agreement that I thought I would find on the ground. This prompted many questions, including what is explaining the gap between theory and practice in this peace agreement, and especially DDR. While doing my master, I decided to research this topic further and find explanations to the shortcomings of the implementation of DDR in Colombia. I found that several factors had deeply impacted the chances of success of DDR in Colombia, and more particularly the reincorporation phase. The first finding is that the transition between phases of DDR is critical. In the first two phases, the process is more straightforward, technical, and it requires the involvement of less actors, 3 in this case. Whereas reintegration is a long-term process which encompasses social, historical, cultural, and economic considerations. It requires more individual considerations and considerable resources. It is widely agreed that the reintegration phase of DDR is the most challenging. In Colombia, demobilization and disarmament were very successful phases where the FARC, the UN, and the Colombian government collaborated successfully. However, the planning of the reintegration phase was rushed during the negotiations of the peace agreement in 2016 because of the end of President Santos' term. The phase remained underprepared until the beginning of implementation. At the start of the reincorporation period, there were significant disagreements within the National Reincorporation Council as to whether the reintegration should be individual or collective, which is why I'm referring to reincorporation. This disagreement lasted a year and translated into a lack of strategy that integrates the need of former combatants. This caused significant delays and hampered trust within parties, as former combatants had disarmed for months and still could not access the benefits that should be given to them. To this day, only a quarter of former combatants benefited from financial support towards their economic project. There are early warnings that this could lead many former combatants to retake arms, whether with FARC dissidents or other armed groups, but these warnings were not sufficiently addressed in programming. These shortcomings empowered FARC dissidents who called others to take up arms again in August 2019. It is fair to say that this lack of preparation and strategy specifically affects women. A specific example gathered from an interview indicated the construction of a daycare facility within a reincorporation camp. However, these daycares did not have staff, which meant that the women could not leave their children in those buildings and still had to care for them during the day and not be able to attend to their role within the reintegration process. If these flows extend to many reintegration camps in the country, it leads to a several limitation of women's participation in DDR, which represent a significant security risk in the long term. The role of women is guaranteed in the peace process, which was held as one of the most progressive in the world in terms of gender provision, but its implementation is lacking. There is, for example, a lack of women representative in key reincorporation institutions. It is important to remember that More of a third of FARC members were women, and they judged the organization as considering gender equality more than the society as a whole. A failure to include women in DDR results in long-term security risk and the potential to disfranchise women from the agreement. Another key finding from my research was the reintegration versus reincorporation strategy. The FARC opted for collective reincorporation in Colombia, while the experience the country had, as well as its institution, were with individual reintegration processes. This made the case of the FARC rather unique in the world in terms of reincorporation, but the group wanted to support their ideology and reject the individual neoliberal blueprint of an individual reintegration. The FARC picked remote rural areas where they used to have control for them to become reincorporation camps. This would also make it easier for them to escape and remain safe in case the agreement failed. This decision to me testified of the lack of trust between parties and the risk former combatants took while disarming. However, this implied that FARC former combatants would want to remain together instead of going back to their families or cities for better opportunities, which failed to materialize as many former combatants wanted to rejoin their families. These remote areas also meant people would be away from basic infrastructure and services. This led to an exodus of former combatants from the remote reincorporation camps, which makes it hard for them to be provided with not only reincorporation services, but protection. By protecting their political collective agenda, FARC underestimated several factors which today translate into a major security issue for former combatants. Since 2017, more than 200 former combatants have been murdered, 2020 being the worst years in terms of former combatants killed. Social leaders supporting the peace process are also very targeted. The whole approach of FARC was based on the ideology of a guerrilla and not according to realistic economic assessment, which represented a significant obstacle for its implementation. The choice of remote rural areas also led to the problem of land, as the former combatants mainly had rural agricultural projects, but no land was available for them. The reincorporation process never had a strategy for former combatants to access the land they needed. In 2020, still no plot of land was allocated. Land has always been a cause for conflict in Colombia, and no land reforms happened since colonization. This worrying fact is only reinforced by the fact that only half of the land in the country is actually registered. This significant limitation leaves half of the country's territory up for grab, susceptible to violence and illicit activities, which creates a significant security vacuum for armed groups to compete over. The current government is in the process of establishing land registries. However, it is very important to stress the importance of land reforms to achieve lasting peace in Colombia, not only reincorporation. As long as the issue of land is not addressed, not only would it greatly affect the chances of reincorporation, but it would embolden armed groups and fuel violence and displacement. To conclude, I would like to reiterate the importance of the transition between the phases of DDR. I would like to emphasize as well the choice of collective reincorporation as critical and explaining a lot of the shortcomings we're seeing today in Colombia. Finally, to avoid more political instability at the national level, it is essential to analyze the role of the land in this conflict and in reincorporation of former combatants. Just 20% of FARC dissidents would still form the biggest guerrilla in the country. The peace process, and more particularly the reincorporation phase, is at a critical point, and it's important now more than ever to follow its implementation, to support organizations implementing the provisions, and to lobby for full implementation of the peace agreement. Thank you for your attention, and I am now looking forward to answering any questions you might have. Thank you.